Okay, so the last part of our seminar is the round table. And we are going to use that to further discuss that issues that have come up, but we have not spent much time probably discussing during the presentations. So one common thread that came up in all of these presentations was the question of power and also the attempts for counterpower, or the questions of hegemony and the dealing with a hegemony of ideas as well as vested interests. So I would just sort of open it for people to elaborate in different ways that they want. We had before a discussion on the think tanks that you didn't elaborate too much. We also talked about property rights as a fundamental concept in the neoliberal thought collective. And so I can just open it and we can discuss these issues.
Can I wanted to bring up something in as part of what thinking about how power plays into this. Josh mentioned to me at one of the breaks that, okay, we're still waiting for a definition of neoliberalism. And Zdravka pointed out there isn't one. And I want to get at sort of really why that is. And it's related to this question of power. The reason defining neoliberalism is ultimately so elusive is because of its because of the capacity of the advocates of neoliberalism to keep co-opting the arguments of their critics and redefining itself so that they can achieve the goals that they have set out in terms of maintaining that power. And so I want to throw that idea out there.
And speaking of co-opting, we talked a lot about neoclassical economics, but remember, neoclassical economics is a subset of what we call mainstream economics. And when we talk about co-opting, what comes to mind is what is referred to as economics imperialism, which is basically trying to answer everything with some economics too. And this includes even theories such as, or concepts such as social capital, or even developments on the margins of neoclassical economics, like behavioral economics. So I just want to broaden up and to use actually a broader term, mainstream economics, which includes, for example, behavioral economics, as one of sort of the foundations of the, what we refer to as neoliberal thought, and not to just narrow it to neoclassical economics per se.
So in terms of co-opting, Nick had asked a question about communities and how to think about communities. This was a question after the for the first session. And one of the things that, when Barbara talks about how the neoliberal project tries to co-opt different terms, concepts, different movements, one of the things that has happened in terms of using sort of community as an alternative to either to private property or state property is this co-opting of the community in the neoliberal project. So there have been a lot of World Bank and other financial and development agencies that are now pushing this notion of community onto countries of the global south. So community then doesn't become an alternative to private property, or it becomes an alternative specifically to this what neoliberals construct as state intervention, right? So the community then is something that plays with the market, but with the help of the state, but as a way to counter state intervention. I know that sounds a little convoluted, but that's what we see in terms of community. So you can think about currently, especially what's happening in South Asia, but also in some parts of Africa, is communities and also in the US and some parts of, well, the US, is you think about communities as part of what the market offers, this decentralization, and it comes also from sort of development projects that were implemented in the 1980s that wanted the state to move away from its role of a development state and try and allow non-governmental organizations to play a development role. So they started to talk about community. These communities were, of course, funded by these, by international financial institutions, by development agencies, etc., as a way to, and it represents a rollback of the state, where the state is sort of slowly moving away, and hence all of us are supposed to somehow take care of ourselves, and somehow withstand the onslaught of neoliberalism and sort of the new phase of capitalism that we are currently experiencing.
Actually, I like that statement because it does capture something about the sort of ideological difference between neoliberalism and classical liberalism. Classical liberalism rests on the individual, period. Now we have the community as representative of the individual, right? So there's been a modification of the sort of foundation for activity, but it doesn't violate the rules of the market, so-called, right? Because it accommodates the so-called market, right? So you have a modification, and that's, neoliberalism is obviously a modification of liberalism. That's why it's called neoliberalism, right? New liberalism, right? So there's these seeming differences, but the objective is the same, and that is to weaken the power of the majority of the population and increase the power of a small minority of the population. Moving and all of the evidence that we have with regard to distribution of income, distribution of wealth, no matter where you look, the destruction of union movements and what have you, they all point to the same thing. You have an economic program that moves income, that moves wealth, that moves power, that moves everything away from the majority toward a small minority.
And Harry brought up the question of distribution, of course, that I think that is central in discussing any forms of neoliberalism.
Let me say a couple of things regarding the tension between the market and collectivist entities, right? Collectivist entities might mean the state, right? And the idea would be that the state is a space in which workers can gain more, right? If you read Kaletsky or if you read Keynes, the state is a possible avenue for the workers to enhance their part of the distribution, right? Communities could be that or couldn't, right? So you can think of a truly collectivist entity when we have communities that are really formed with real institutions and which really represent some organic relations between the participants. And then we have the example of the World Bank, where the World Bank comes from the outside and in order to save its face says, you guys are a community and I am going to have a development project here and I'm going to show you that everything's going to work out. If I increase your ties with the market, right, and rather than treating you at the individual level, I am going to try to incorporate these communities into the global market. Again, I think that what we are dealing with here is again the shift of power, right? And the shift of power towards capital. That's the way that I understand neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a phase of capitalism, right? Even in the 1950s, 1960s, we were in capitalism, right? The fact that the state determined the rules of the game in a much more heavy manner than it did later does not change the essence of the system, right? And the system is a system in which labor surplus is being appropriated by boards of directors in companies, and workers get exploited. I mean, like, that's whether the state plays an active role in that or not does not change the essence of the system. Now, in the neoliberal era, workers have lost part of the game, right? And that's, I think, the way that I understand neoliberalism. Workers have receded significantly in terms of the things that they could acquire from the state, right? You go to a public university and still you have to pay, I don't know how many thousands of dollars in tuition fees every year, right? You don't have healthcare, and that's another large matter. So it's a lot of these things that we could expect the state to give us have been lost, right? And we lose parts of the things that we were expecting. Now, at the academic level, I might be digressing here, but there's powers and there's counterpowers, right? So if you were a neoclassical economist and you were writing in 2005 or 2006 or 2007, you would never mention the word crisis, right? That's the truth of the matter. Open whatever journal you want from that period of time and you're not going to find anything about crisis, right? You're not going to find anything about power. We're all optimizing, either maximizing profits or maximizing profit. There's no power considerations when we talk about neoclassical economics, right? And the truth of the matter is that this does not tell you much about the world that we are experiencing after 2008, 2007, 2008, right? So I guess, like, I'm digressing completely, but again, the project in some senses, how do we put considerations of that into economic thought so that we make economic thought relevant, right? And how can we talk about power? How can we talk about distribution in the post-2008 era, where crisis is not just a result of real business cycles, but actually might mean something either because of financial instability or because of the tendency of the profit rate to fall, or whatever your consideration might be, whatever your explanation might be.
Okay. As we have seen from Harry's presentation and Turkey's presentation and John's presentation, there has been some tremendous changes in the economic system. So one aspect of that, the neoliberal, the restructuring was the increasing income inequality and also the changes in the wealth distribution. Also, we are observing recurring crises in the economic system, which in other words, is economic system is become more unstable. This is the all aspect of, I would say, the neoliberal economic system. Then the question is this system toward that kind of end, is this system is sustainable or viable? I don't think so. But even that private firms and the government and international organizations are aware of that. Especially, I believe you mentioned about it, some kind of responsibility of the private firms' responsibility, and they are trying to say that we are responsible for the community, we are responsible for some social welfare. But this is just, from my point of view, the way to continue their project, continue their business in the very unstable economy. So that the question about the community and the question about the responsibility and the question about the private, the business firms are all connected in some sense, in one way or another, in this kind of situation.
I'm still pondering, so I'll pass for a second.
I think also, Harry, you brought up the issue of, the state as a collective, right? And one of the things that we have to sort of rethink, or, in economics is thinking about, both the state and the market, but especially at the state, like what is the state? We often think about the state as some kind of sort of independent entity that's sort of imposed on us. But if you're talking about a democratic state, it is meant to be a collective, and that's why your point about sort of voters no longer having as much of a say as one expects in a democracy is so relevant, and that's something that we don't often sort of theorize in economics, well, unless you do new political economy or something, but it's not very, I think, we don't, or mainstream economics doesn't sort of theorize or think about what that collective actually means and how does power play in that, right? So how does the power of, if you were to, in a very broad sense, categorize people as workers or capitalists, how does, does the state reflect the power of the workers, or does it reflect the power of capitalists, right? And so that's an important thing. The other thing is also, of course, how do we think about these, communities, as an alternative to market or state, or the state? What is the historical and the institutional context under which these other institutions arise, right? So, the state, what is the role of the state? The role of the state in the US, of course, has been very different from the role of the state in Germany, and it has been very different from the role of the state in India or in Bangladesh or whatever, right? So what is the history, what is the history under which these institutions arise? And that's why, going back to Tahi's sort of presentation about how, that's part of what economics has done, right? Is distancing sort of the curriculum away from sort of economic history, or sort of, the history of thought, like how are we at this point where crisis is not mentioned in most economic, or was not mentioned in most economic journals, right? Or power is not mentioned in most economic journals, right? So, how has power evolved even within the institution of the academy, as far as the economics field is concerned?
Any other thoughts? And the question of history is actually very important because, it's easy to define neoliberalism, as we said, in the last 30 years or so, but going back to what you told us about, of course, that puts it in a whole other perspective in terms of redefining or saving the initial idea and reinventing it. And so in the context of what Tahi said, that if you think that then our system is unsustainable, then it needs again some new type of reinvention. So do you think that perhaps this type of reinvention is again the concern about environment and addressing this environmental issue and the neoliberal sort of responses that Harry was talking about? Is this like a new phase to, or attempt to reinvent yourself as a system, sorry, to preserve yourself?
My immediate answer is I don't know, but every system needs successes. I think that this is something that we can agree, right? And can we point our finger on the successes of the neoliberal project over the past 30 years? Can we say that this was something that was successful, right? And unless you look at profits, there's nothing else, right? What can we really say that, capitalism has done better over the past 30 years than it did before, right? Incomes for the workers? No, not really. Decreasing inequality? No. So you need something to be able to point to us as something that the system can actually do well, right? And with the exception of profit rates, and especially profit rates for some sectors, like financial profits, the clear example of high, steady profit rates over the past 30 years. It's really difficult to find other success stories. Now, are we moving to a phase of green capitalism or anything like that? I think partly we're running out of ideas, right? I think that Europe is a good case for that right now. Because if you look at the discussion in Europe about what is going to get us out of the crisis, there's nothing, right? There really isn't anything, other than people hoping that, we can do some green growth or stuff like that. There's nothing else. Without this saying that, I don't think that the system actually has good ideas, I mean, like capital has good ideas, about how to legitimize its performance. I don't know if that answers anything, but I think that, yes, we need to reinvent capitalism. I don't know, I'm going to leave it at that, I guess, before I...
And when you talked about heterodox economics, of course, this is embodiment of varieties of approaches. So you have different starting points. There is no homogeneity within the heterodox approach. But there are, of course, some fundamental differences from the so-called neoliberal thought collective, to use Philip Mirovsky's term. So, of course, I mean, then this opens the question of heterodox economics as a thought collective too.
Yes.
Which must be if there is has to be some sort of a alternative narrative to what we have. Would you think that it's a thought collective? I mean, we don't want we have this negative connotation.
I think that's an appropriate way to characterize heterodoxy, because there is no unanimity, there is no agreement on every aspect of these different theoretical perspectives that comprise heterodox economics, right? And if you look, and even within any particular general theory, like post-Keynesian or Marxism or whatever, institutionalism, you see differences within specific camps, right? So one of the problems, I think, that the opposition has, and it's not a problem, it's essentially, I think, the same problem at the theoretical level as at the practical level. Technically speaking, we understand that modern capitalism is so-called global, right? The opposition, and it's organized on a global level. One of the reasons you have organizations like the Trilateral Commission is to get both capitalists and representatives of capitalism together to discuss essentially policy or programs, right? And by the way, and here's one of the great, I think, overlooked facets of modern capitalism. It's not just modern capitalism. This has been going on for quite some time, even before neoliberalism. If you look at the individuals who convene in, let's say, the Trilateral Commission, okay? You have people that you would expect. You have executives of major businesses. You also have the principal editors of the principal newspapers. You also have trade union leaders. You also have leaders of civil rights organizations. You have presidents of institutions like Cambridge, well, they don't call him president over there, but you know what I mean. Harvard, McGill, you know, you go down the list of the top 50 universities in the world, and they are represented on a rotating basis, right? And they're meeting, and they're discussing, and they're holding conferences. And the idea is to formulate, obviously, why would you meet unless you were to formulate objectives, right? So you bring all these people together and say, okay, what needs to be done? Classic illustration of this. Go to 1970, I think the year is 3, and the Trilateral Commission held a conference entitled The Crisis of Democracy. And early 70s, this is when the stuff hit the fan, right? You were talking in your presentation, Harry, it was the early 1970s, okay? Lots and lots and lots of stuff happened. Okay, Trilateral Commission, The Crisis of Democracy. Samuel Huntington's piece, Harvard professor of political science and one of the architects of the Vietnam War. Okay? And he's responding to the developments of the 60s. What were the developments of the 60s? Well, you had a reinvigorated union movement. You had a civil rights movement that was quite militant, quite active, right? You had a student movement. You had all of these developments that were in fact, whether knowledgeably or not, is that a word, knowledgeably? With foresight or not, moving against capital, right? In the early 70s, capital responds, okay? What does Huntington tell all of these people assembled at this conference? And he's speaking to trade union leaders, civil rights leaders, student union leaders, right? Student movement leaders. And down the line, he's talking to newspaper editors, he's talking to the presidents of CBS, NBC. I'm not sure who was there anymore, but I can look it up, because I know who was there. Well, I knew who was there. And I can know again, right? And he's saying, look, we have a crisis in authority here. Who the heck is supposed to be in charge, right? It's not the people in the streets. You have to bring your people under control. And he's talking to the chair or the president, I'm not sure the title, of the Urban League, which was a major civil rights organization. He's talking to the presidents of the leading universities. He's talking to union leaders. One of the people at that conference was Lane Kirkland, who was at that point president of the AFL-CIO. And he's telling Lane Kirkland, you've lost control of your own membership. Bring them back under proper authority, right? And proper authority is obeisant to capital. And he's very forthright, right? And Samuel Huntington's no fool. He's not an idiot, right? It's a very, just get a hold of that. The crisis of democracy, and look at Samuel Huntington's piece. What the heck were we talking about? Am I done? Or was that that was the preface, I think, to what I wanted to say, but I...
So I think that's very interesting point. I mean, so I personally have no shame in trying to adopt that model for my own ends. So
Exactly, precisely.
I'm perfectly happy to think about what it takes to get a heterodox economics thought collective connected with movements and connected with media outlets that are more receptive.
I think that
It's not
was,
falsify knowledge, because they
Yeah.
also...
No.
I think that was the point, because that's where we started, was this sort of question where he was saying, look, what they've done really well is to coordinate globally. And that's what the alternative doesn't do as well.
Correct.
Now, part of the reason, by the way, if you look at that income distribution, it's a lot easier for everybody to meet in Davos if you have 80% of the income. Okay, if the top 1% has 40%, it's just a lot easier to do that. And it's also a lot easier for those people to fund the journalists that they want to bring in, and, and convince them why they should be supporting your interests. But there's another aspect of this, which is the capital is always also holding us hostage. If you don't bail out the big banks, your pension fund is going to be destroyed. If you don't cut taxes on the 1%, there will be no jobs. Really? Does that really make any sense? We haven't been doing that good at creating jobs as it is. And actually, that's the point, by the way, that Ha-Joon Chang makes. He says, I'm not opposed to capitalism. I'm not even opposed to us giving most of our money to the rich people, as long as the rich people do their job, which is to invest in the economy. But they're not. They're too busy investing in those speculative oil markets, which doesn't create anything. And so a huge amount, part of this has been about sort of neoliberalism as a project, but this stage of capitalism is also largely driven by that rise in financial markets, which is sucking more and more of the resources out of the real economy. So there are other aspects of the last, of what neoliberalism has wrought in terms of the structure of the economy that both reinforces the power of capital and strengthens the power of capital vis-a-vis labor and increases the probability of crisis.
Well, the other part, is sort of, constituting, some kind of opposition is that we're also divided, right? So, we think about, in Ohio, for instance, people, it's an auto industry, and Kathy brought up the issue of the Indian auto industry. And so popular conception is that jobs are moving away from the US to India and China and Vietnam and Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that under neoliberalism, these jobs that are moving away, just because they move to India or China doesn't mean that those workers are necessarily doing better, that they necessarily have a better standard of living. And in fact, as Kathy has mentioned, in terms of the auto industry in India, there's been sort of, quite a bit of sort of repression of people organizing, as a union, asking for better wages, which in fact is very legal in India. So it's not an illegal project that they're involved in. And so you see also this onslaught against organized movements, both labor but other kinds of social movements. And so on the one hand, you see the state repression. On the other hand, workers in these different countries are unable to sort of see the similarities between their economic situations, and instead, are held hostage to, the kind of narratives and the kind of, policy imperatives that are pushed on us and them.
Yeah. If I can just add one brief comment here. Oh, were you going to stop? Okay. I think whenever I talk to someone from the UAW, this always comes up, I think. And whenever this comes up, my retort is, have you actually measured how many jobs have gone to the US South from Detroit and Michigan as opposed to India and China? And as soon as I say that, all I get is one dumbfounded expression because they don't know how to respond to that. They've not actually done the study. You can do it, it's pretty straightforward just based on government statistics. And there's a very clear explanation for that, why that's happened as well, which they're not willing to deal with, which is the southern states have very labor laws that are not favorable to organizing, right? So it is, I think, a very strong and unfortunate misconception that there are jobs fleeing to India and China. I mean, of course, there's outsourcing, but the exaggeration seems to overweigh that.
Well, I think there's a deeper issue there. If, let's say, U.S. workers take the position that their jobs are being given to workers in India, China, wherever, okay? There's two misconceptions. First of all, it's not their job. The job is owned by the boss, however you define the boss, okay? It's not their job to begin with. Secondly, all right, if you look at it from a pure worker's perspective, why should a U.S. worker be disadvantaged? This is a misconception, but why should a worker in the U.S. be disadvantaged solely, should complain about being disadvantaged solely because a worker in India is being advantaged? In other words, if you're a worker, what you want is a form of economic and social organization that benefits you as a worker. It shouldn't matter whether you're a worker in the United States or a worker in India. It shouldn't matter whether you're male, female. It shouldn't matter whether you're black, white, whatever. It shouldn't matter whether you're from Bulgaria. Well, maybe that does matter. And what has happened, workers and others have been successfully divided on all sorts of lines, including lines of nationhood, right? I mean, I should have, in a reasonable world, exactly the same sympathy, to use Adam Smith's term, for workers in Athens as I do for workers in Dayton. There should be no difference, right? I shouldn't see them as Greek, or I shouldn't see them as Ohioans or Ohioites or whatever you people call yourselves. I should just see them as workers, right? And I should see the carpenter as the same as a university professor. Now, in reality, of course, that's not going to happen, right? And in reality, some workers are advantaged, right? You can't tell me that a Yale University professor of economics pulling in $250,000 a year with all the perks is exploited, right? Henry at UMKC may be exploited, but not, well, whomever. We won't mention names. So there are workers who are going to be advantaged. So it's not that, you say workers of the world unite. Yeah, true, 80% of us, 90% of us. Now, how do you bring that about? And one of the ways you have to bring it about is through organizing effective means of communication, right? That's your job, because I'm very bad at that sort of stuff. Right?
Well, I actually think we are out of time, and we may have discussion after that individually, but I will just remind you to visit the website, and we are going to be uploading the video eventually there, as well as some of the PowerPoints that we have, and there are also additional readings, and the talks were based on publications that these people have been, and activities that they have been doing. So you can check the website. It's on your program, or you can search in Google Neoliberalism Seminar and find it. Thank you for coming and for sticking.
Thank you.